I got the divorce papers by email while I was still deployed. 13 years of marriage ended in a PDF attachment. Have you ever had your entire life collapse in a single click? My name is Sarah Collins, a logistics officer with the U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division. I had been in Kuwait for 4 months when my husband, Mark Collins, decided he was done waiting. The subject line of his message read, "Let's be adults about this." The body was 3 sentences. He'd filed the paperwork, he'd emptied our joint account, and he'd moved his new girlfriend into our house in Boise. I remember staring at that screen until the letters blurred, feeling the desert heat and the hum of electronics around me like something distant and unreal. No argument, no chance to speak, no dignity. In that moment, I realized one thing about myself that I've carried ever since. I don't start fights, but I always finish them. If you want to understand how this became less about anger and more about a methodical campaign of getting my life back, you have to understand how I am wired. The Army shapes you to see problems as missions. Missions have objectives, assets, timelines, and contingencies. They are not solved with shrill spectacle. They are dismantled with patience, intelligence, and steady pressure in the right places. So when my marriage unraveled, I stopped looking for drama and started compiling evidence. It hadn't been a sudden implosion. 6 months before I deployed, the little things started to change. Mark stopped asking about my day. He started working late at the bank more often, saying he had extra paperwork. He took up cycling, the mall kind, and suddenly had new clothes, new playlists, new friends he never invited me to meet. He stopped laughing at my stupid jokes. He stopped rolling his eyes at my obsession with detail. I'm not naive. I saw the signs. But there are ways to rear. The first tangible betrayal was a notification from our bank 2 weeks after the email. A withdrawal of $88,000. Our joint account, the one Mark and I had built up over the years, gone. The savings we had painstakingly socked away for future repairs, vacations, retirement, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. I sat in the mess tent with my fork halfway to my mouth and watched the world move around me as if in a film strip while my own life collapsed in real time. I called the bank from a military line on a palm-sized phone and learned that small transfers had begun months earlier and that the large transfers started the day after I deployed. Somebody had treated my absence like permission. When I called Mark, I left a voice message, actually. I wasn't ready to be rattled. There was no temper. There was a calmness that felt rehearsed. "It's easier this way," he said later in one of his texts. "We're just making adult choices." He used the same phrase in the email. Adult, clinical, neat. That's when I shifted from surviving to strategizing. I'm not a vindictive person by nature. I don't enjoy chaos. But the Army made me efficient, and there is an efficiency to corrective action when you're being wronged. I got in touch with my old buddy from law school days, James Monroe, a civilian lawyer I'd kept in contact with whenever I was back in the States. I told him everything I knew and everything I suspected. He told me not to do anything dramatic. "You want the law to carry the weight of your retribution," he said. "Emotion is noise. Documentation is power." So we documented. James put me in touch with a private investigator who specialized in financial cases involving deployed spouses. We filed a police report about unexplained withdrawals. I logged into the home security feed from an app I had installed months earlier, something Mark he thought was overcautious. The video showed a stranger's truck in our driveway, a man I'd never seen new walking our dog with my coffee mug in his hands, wearing my faded army sweatshirt. Becky, no, his girlfriend's name here was Emily Brooks, was laughing in the kitchen I'd renovated myself. It wasn't anger that shifted inside me watching that footage. It was cold clarity. Everything I did from then on had to be airtight. The threads started to show themselves when James dug into the paperwork. A refinance application had been filed using my signature, but the middle initial was wrong. The pen strokes didn't match the other documents. Someone had forged my name to pull cash against our house equity. The loan officer had processed a refinance, and the money had quickly moved through accounts and then out. There were transfers to a handful of suspicious names. One of them belonged to a real estate agent who specialized in quick cash deals, Ethan Porter. Another name prepended the deposits in a way that suggested earnest money for a sale, and the boyfriend, Liam Brooks, had a record of DUIs and a prior charge related to small-time fraud the investigator found with a casual online search. It was less an isolated betrayal and more a pattern. When I came home on emergency leave 2 months later, I didn't announce it. I checked into a motel under a fake name and let James drive me around town like a civilian, two people who had been married at one point and were now two strategists sizing up the field. We sat in a diner 10 miles outside the city, and he slid a folder across the table. Every document I needed to confirm my suspicion was in that folder: mortgage paperwork with my forged signature, bank statements showing transfers tracing to Ethan's clients, invoices that didn't add up. James tapped a paper. "She's either been managed expertly by a con, or she's complicit," he said. "Either way, this looks criminal." I didn't feel vindictive then. I felt aligned. I felt like a general surveying a map and seeing all the routes laid out. I met with the refinance officer at the bank and put my military ID on the table with a calm I didn't feel. I showed him my real signature and the forged one. He went pale. "I'll need to report this," he said, voice nervous. "We'll freeze the funds." I'd already filed a police report. I'd already prepared affidavits. We were building an iron case. But part of the scheme had already moved. About half of the refinance money had been routed away, $14,600, into accounts that were already being siphoned to cover urgent expenses and to move cash out of reach. James recommended we subpoena the recipient accounts. We learned the transfers had been used as earnest money arranged by Ethan Porter and passed through a buyer's shell account. The buyer was a repeat player on his books, and Liam Brooks had indeed worked with him before. More discovery came when I used the security cameras I'd installed for peace of mind and, as it turned out, as evidence. Watching the footage with the volume up is something I will never forget. Ethan and Liam in my living room, then taking photos with the practiced gaze of a man who sells worry-free transitions to unsuspecting owners, Liam pointing at the features as if reciting a script. Ethan said, "We'll list at $470 and take $420. Everybody's happy." Liam waved it off. "These military guys will take a settlement," he said. "Deployments make them soft. They'll take the first check to make the noise go away." They laughed. They counted on me being a satellite of absence. James recorded the feed on his phone with a shiver of glee and forwarded it to the FBI agent an old colleague had referred us to. Agent Vega and Agent Morales met with James and me in Spokane. They were calm, methodical, and very, very precise. "This pattern," Agent Vega said, "crosses jurisdictional lines, could be wire fraud, conspiracy, identity theft. That's government language for the stakes being high enough to be worth prosecuting. They asked me not to confront Mark or Liam. They told me to let them move. Detective work requires patience because haste breaks chains of custody and destroys cases, which, for someone who had spent a career watching checklists and contingencies, was music to my ears. I like the contained procedural power of them doing their job. My role was simpler, to feed them everything: statements, timestamps, bank logs, security footage. In the meantime, I made the quieter choices that kept me financially afloat. I sold what I could, I rented a small apartment outside town, I started carpentry work on weekends for locals because I knew how to use my hands, and because there's something honest about physical labor that quiets a mind that's been betrayed. The build-up was as much psychological as tactical. People think revenge means an explosion. In reality, it's often a sequence of precise actions that turn the inertia of wrongdoing into evidence and then into consequence. We gathered the documents, subpoenaed the transfer records, got phone logs, and tracked conversation chains. Ethan Porter's pattern was damning. He had been involved in at least 3 similar transactions in the past 2 years, where a deployed spouse returned to find their home short-sold or encumbered, often with people who had prior records, men like Liam who show up, charm a spouse during vulnerability, and then steer the house into quick cash deals. The feeds, the bank ledgers, and the county clerk's files began to match like a series of puzzle pieces that, when put together, revealed a larger image of predation. One morning, while James and I watched the security feed from a park bench across the street, I felt the extraordinary normalcy of the neighborhood. The same quiet cul-de-sacs, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs. At 9:30, Mark's car stayed in the driveway, and at 9:45, Emily emerged and drove toward Riverfront Park. 20 minutes later, a car with a real estate logo pulled up and Ethan Porter walked up the front steps. Liam greeted him like a man expecting a payday. Ethan took pictures, pointed at the same things he had pointed at in the footage we'd already seen, and mentioned listing price as if the house were already property of a transaction. The arrogance that radiated from them was almost comedic until your life is the subject of their banter. James turned the volume up on the feed and said, "You want to get this now?" I thought of running to the house and confronting them, of the messy theatre that might feel good in a moment, but would have torn apart the legal case the FBI was building. I sat back and watched. On the day they brought charges, I sat with Agent Vega in the field office and watched as they punched in statements and typed the findings. For long stretches, I felt nothing but a mechanical calm. Sometimes the mind protects itself by becoming efficient. But there were moments of quiet sweetness amid the chaos. One afternoon, months after the first email, I received a letter from a woman in Fort Worth. Her husband had been deployed in the Navy when Liam and Ethan tried the same scheme on her family. "You don't know me," she wrote, "but you saved our home. Thank you." I read that letter several times. I pinned it to my refrigerator next to a post-it note that said, "Document everything. Breathe." Those two little items, one bureaucratic, one human, kept me anchored. The legal fight was messy in the way courts are: paperwork, depositions, attorney strategy, the tedium that makes eventual clarity possible. In the end, the plea deals meant jail time for the primary schemers and restitution for those whose funds could be traced and reclaimed. Ethan took 12 years because he had a pattern and the ring reached across state lines. Liam took 8 years. Mark, my husband, maintained that he didn't know the full extent of the scheme, that Emily had seduced him into a series of choices, and that he had been swept along by loans he thought were legitimate. He cried in front of the judge, like a man who had miscalculated the cost. The court ordered full restitution of the stolen funds and bartered away any claim he or Emily had on the house. I didn't press for his incarceration. I pressed for restitution. My goal had never been to ruin a life for cruelty's sake. It was to make sure the theft was undone and to ensure that the system could identify a pattern that would protect others. There were small victories that felt huge. The bank that had initially processed the refinance agreed to change some of its internal controls after our complaint exposed vulnerabilities. The county clerk's office tightened signature verification processes for certain high-risk loans. The FBI created a working group to coordinate with local banks to spot irregular refinancing activity for service members and other people likely to be absent for legitimate reasons. Those bureaucratic shifts aren't cinematic, but they mean that the next deployed wife or husband might not return to the same trap. When the divorce was finalized 6 months after that first email, it was a clean, no-fault split. I walked out of the courthouse with a folder of papers that said I'd been made whole in financial terms and legally free of a man who'd chosen his path. On the day the last paperwork was signed, Agent Vega called me with news on a sentence. "Liam Brooks was sentenced today," he said. 8 years for fraud and identity theft. Ethan Porter got 12. There was a tightness in my throat, a strange mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. I had not wanted someone to suffer so I could feel better. I wanted the scales to be balanced. The justice system, imperfect as it is, did what I asked it to do. It recognized a pattern, it punished the planners, and it returned funds where they could be found. After all the noise, it feels absurd to say I didn't hate Mark. I don't. There was a long period after the trials where I moved like a person who had shed a skin and stepped into a new one. I sold the house because the walls held too many small betrayals, minor footprints of a life neither of us wanted anymore. I bought a small cabin outside Missoula, Montana, 2 bedrooms, 10 acres, a creek that sings at night. I took early retirement from the army after 20 years. It felt like time. The quiet of the creek and the smell of fresh-cut wood were salves I didn't know I needed. I named the German Shepherd I got to keep me company Scout. I do carpentry for friends and neighbours, and sometimes I build furniture for people who want honest things in their houses. It's honest work, slow and tangible. The stitches in the wood remind me that things can be repaired and made whole again. Sometimes, on long afternoons, I read through the paperwork I kept in a neat folder labelled Case. I reread Agent Vega's notes, the restitution orders, the letters from other victims. In one of them, a woman in Fort Worth wrote that because of the FBI's work, she and her kids were still in their house. In another, someone from Oklahoma wrote, "We were ready to give up. Thank you for not letting us be forgotten." Those letters are pinned to my fridge alongside the practical notes, mortgage contacts, numbers for the VA, a reminder to check Scouts' vaccinations. It's ridiculous how those practical notes and those grateful letters live side by side, but maybe that's precisely where healing sits, between the everyday and the extraordinary. There were moments I did not expect. On the anniversary of the first email, I sometimes feel a familiar prick of sadness, like a bruise just beneath the skin. I think back to the early years with Mark, camped out in a small apartment, dreaming about buying a house, Chisha, ring when promotions came through. There were good years at the beginning, before the greed and the strangers. Those memories are not negated by what came later. They exist in parallel with the betrayal. I had allowed myself to grieve the loss of what might have been. Justice did not make grief evaporate. It simply gave me a different frame for that grief. Once, a year after it all, I went back to Boise for a court follow-up and drove by the neighborhood where the house stood. It had been sold, a different car in the driveway, curtains new. I felt a small, strange relief. The house, the idea of home as we once shared it, had been disentangled from me. I am no longer defined by those rooms. I had rebuilt a house of my life from the ground up in Montana, simpler, quieter, mine. People ask me sometimes if I'm over it. I don't like the implication of that phrase, as if there's an expiration stamp on feeling. If by over it they mean, am I still vigilant, then yes, of course. If they mean, do I wish the past away? No, I carry it like a map. The important thing is it no longer directs my every step. It informs me. I make decisions now from a place of experience, not of fear. The last thread of closure came in the form of a simple email from a woman in Fort Worth who had been part of that cluster of victims. She wrote that her husband had come home, shaken but whole, and that the family had been restored. They were not wealthy. They had lost time and sleep. But because someone had been willing to hold the pattern up to sunlight, they had a chance to recover. "We were fighting back when it would have been easier to walk away," she wrote. I printed that line and kept it. Some days I read it like prayer. If I have a moral to this, it isn't a lesson in hate or revenge. It's a lesson in boundaries and vigilance and the power of systems when leveraged rightly. People prey on absence. They seek out predictable vulnerabilities. You can respond with theatrics, or you can respond with cold, tenacious paperwork that never gets tired and never mistakes sentiment for strategy. I used every skill I'd been taught in the army, patience, contact discipline, logistics, to make sure that justice had the path it needed. The system was imperfect, but with the right evidence and persistence, it did its work. Sometimes I think about Mark and what he lost beyond the obvious. I think about how easy it is to choose immediate gratification over long-term value. I think about how many people we pass in life who are quietly building fortresses of self-preservation, and how many of those fortresses are built from tiny, smart decisions: a safe deposit box, a separate bank account, a camera on the porch. Those are not cynical moves, they are mature ones. They are the marks of people who know their own worth and refuse to let someone else redefine it for them. I live now by a creek, and I wake up to Scout nudging my elbow. I measure my days in small, ordinary things: the curve of a dovetail joint, the smell of cedar, the way sunlight slants through the pines in the afternoon. I teach a neighbor kid how to plane a board. I drive into town for coffee and see other veterans in the line and trade stories about nothing important. Life is quieter, but not empty. It has a depth that wasn't present when everything was wrapped around the axis of a marriage that failed in brutal, complicated ways. If someone asks me if I'd do anything differently, I'll say this: I wish I had noticed earlier and protected myself sooner. I wish I had been less forgiving of small lies and more attentive to the patterns, but I won't. Spend time on regret that doesn't serve. The facts are the facts. I lost money. I lost years. I lost trust. I gained back my name, some restitution, and a conviction that the system, when fed with evidence and tenacity, can work. I also gained new peace, the kind that shows up not as fireworks, but as a steady light at the end of the trail. Sometimes at night I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and look at the creek and think about the letters pinned to my fridge. The woman from Fort Worth once wrote, "You saved our home. You saved our sleep." It is humbling to think that my stubborn refusal to let the paperwork go unchallenged helped other people keep roofs over their heads. That is a kind of victory I did not expect when I clicked "understood" on that email in a desert. That one click that once felt like the end became the catalyst for something larger than me, a net, thin at first, but woven stronger as more people pulled together the threads. In the end, my life is no longer defined by what someone else stole or by what I lost. It's defined by what I chose to build afterward. I still finish what I start. I always will.